Okay, so today I have with me Dr. Michael Israetel. Did I spell that right?
Yeah, it was good.
Yeah. Hi, Mike. How are you doing today?
Good. Thanks for having me on. I'm doing quite well.
Great to hear. And thank you so much for agreeing to do this interview on training for hypertrophy. So, before we start, could you give us a short introduction about yourself, your background, and what you currently work with?
Yeah, so I'm originally from Russia, and then when I was 7 years old, my family moved to the United States, and I grew up, playing a few sports. I wrestled in high school, and then for wrestling, I decided to start weight training and maybe watching what I ate, because I wanted to get stronger, and I eventually fell in love with so much with weight training that I quit wrestling. And then in college, in undergrad, I went to the University of Michigan. I did some powerlifting there. I started a powerlifting club. And then I got really, really interested in the science behind training because I felt like if I really knew how everything worked, and of course, science is probably the best path to the truth, then I could get stronger and I could get bigger. In my master's program and then in my PhD at East Tennessee State, got a PhD in sport physiology. It was during that time that I really started to fall in love with the idea of bodybuilding and getting maximally bigger as opposed to stronger. I was still very passionate about strength training, but the size aspect really got me. And ever since then, I've been looking very deeply, giving a lot of thought, reading a lot of literature, and doing my own training and training others in pursuit of maximal size and minimal body fat. And now I'm a professor at Temple University. I'm assistant professor of kinesiology. I teach a bunch of sport science-related courses, nutrition, strength training theory, personal training, etc. And I compete in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and I compete in bodybuilding. So I have that much perspective to bring, I suppose.
Excellent. So, which class in bodybuilding do you compete in?
So I'm going to be trying to make the heavyweight class, which is 225 and under, and I'm going to be. I've done two shows already, and both were in the super heavies, but I wasn't lean enough, so I have the muscle mass to be a top end heavyweight. So
Hmm.
I'm 5'6", it's like a meter 57 or something like that, meter 59.
Hmm.
And so I'm pretty short, but I'm kind of wide. So for me to get below 220 and then carb up is pretty tough. And this diet that I'm on right now is going to take me into another show, hopefully. And it's going to be very tough, but I think good results. And then see what the judges think.
Excellent. So, which federation is this?
NPC,
NPC.
National Physique Committee, is the national arm of the IFBB in the United States.
Okay. Do you still compete in powerlifting as well, or?
No, not for a long time. The last time I competed in powerlifting was, I believe, in 2007. It was
Hmm.
a very long time ago. But I competed for a long time also.
Mm.
I competed for multiple years, and I did raw training and raw lifting back in the day when everyone else did equipment, so I missed the boat on that one.
Oh,
But now I compete in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu quite often, and that's really, really fun, and I love it, absolutely love it. And it's great cardio for bodybuilding, although it gets me hurt a little too much. So my performance in bodybuilding is not as good as it could be if I was not doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, but it's an okay trade-off for me.
yeah. When do you start to back off from the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu before the competition, or do you still do it all the time before?
I actually do more of it so I can burn more calories.
Hmm.
But the nature of the training changes a little bit. I don't take as many risks as I get closer to the competition.
Okay.
I continue to move a lot in practice, and I continue to exert force, but I don't do anything. So there are opportunities in rolling during combat when you can take a big risk for a big payoff. Get certain movements require jumping over something or really wrenching someone one way or another. And those are calculated risks. During most training, I'll take them because I want to be really good. But when a couple of months or especially a couple of weeks before a show, I'll do the more slow, still forceful but slow techniques so that I don't do anything really stupid. I've gotten hurt before shows before. I was going to do a show last year and I got hurt. I didn't do the show, so that's the nature of the beast. I know I'm aware of the trade-offs. So some people ask me, is Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu a good idea to do for bodybuilding? No, absolutely not. It's a terrible idea. But if you want to do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, you can bodybuild at the same time if you're willing to sacrifice some gains in both.
Okay, that's impressive. Actually, to
Thank you.
combine both of them and And also the results you've had in powerlifting as well.
Yeah, well, that was a long time ago, but now, I think two sports is enough for me at once. People say, why don't you powerlift again? I wouldn't even know what to do with my training. I'd have to do all kinds of different training, and I would really start to take away from my success in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and in bodybuilding. Maybe I should do 10 sports, right? But then I wouldn't be any good at any of them.
Yeah,
So.
that's true. Okay, so let's dive into the questions. It's not uncommon for people to still train each muscle group once a week. So, what are your thoughts on doing muscle group only one time a week?
So the biggest thought I have on that is, generally speaking, for the majority of differences between adaptations, probably as high as 70 or 80%, per week volume load, the amount of volume and intensity used in training on average, is the dominant the characteristic that determines the differences in hypertrophy gain between different programs. Frequency, the number of times during that week you actually execute that given unit of volume load that's the same, is a much smaller variable, accounting for roughly 20 to maybe 30% of the differences, maybe not even. It depends on population. So in some population it's going to account for very little, in some populations it's going to account for more. But frequency by itself is already minor. It's already minor. So we have to, before getting into this discussion, I think largely going to be about frequency, which is very, very interesting. It is important. But per week volume load is more important. And a lot of the confounding conclusions about high frequency programs being dominant to low frequency ones is that we're not equating for volume load. Once you equate for volume load, a lot of differences start to disappear. And so frequency is of minimal importance, but it is nonetheless important. And for most athletes, for most people trying to get bigger muscles, once a week stimulation is probably not frequent enough, because these stimulus recovery adaptation cycle, the muscle being disturbed in some way or stimulated, going through its adaptations, completing its adaptations to get bigger than ever, and then resetting to be ready to train again, that whole cycle probably occurs, for most people in less than half a week, or maybe 4 or 5 days in some special situations. But a whole week, man, that's a really long time. Volume loads per week equate 70 or 80% of all results. Volume loads per month, you can imagine you did the biggest leg workout ever that took you 2 whole days, and then the rest of the month you didn't do anything. Volume loads per month equate maybe 30 or 40% of results, maybe less, right? So that frequency definitely matters, and a week, of course, is an arbitrary unit of time designed by humans with no reference to physiology, right? We designed our calendar 7 days, has absolutely nothing to do with our physiology and adaptation. It's not a magical, just once a week. Well, why would that be a magical time frame in which to train optimally? We're just going by the Judeo-Christian or Roman calendar at this point. That's pretty random way to assert things. So I think that for most people, for optimal, best results, in most situations, once a week training is, especially what I'll refer to from now on as overload training or stimulative training. There's other types of more recovery training that come in handy. If you're overloading musculature only once a week, you're probably missing out considerably. If you're smaller, if you're a beginner, and if you're female, you're missing out even more. If you're gigantic, the amount of damage you can do and the amount of time you need to recover probably goes up, so you can get away more with it, which is why we see a lot of professional bodybuilders only train muscle groups, large muscles, once a week. They can get away with it. It's probably not even best for them. But for the really tiny people, my God, how long, if you're adapted to training for 6 months, how long do you experience delayed onset muscle soreness after training once? A couple days, maybe a day. Some smaller females, they don't barely even get sore at all. In order to get them sore, you have to put them through wood chippers. So, and how much fatigue are they carrying after training? Well, not much. You come back Wednesday after a Monday squat session and say, can you squat again? Of course, it would be the easiest thing in the world. Now, if you're really gigantic and you may need more time to recover, and then another session that's lighter may be in order. But 1 week of waiting, man, that's way too much for most people.
Excellent. I know you have an article on if different muscle groups should be trained with different frequencies. Could you explain a bit about that?
Yeah, so generally speaking, muscles that have a smaller mass, a smaller cross-sectional area, and can produce less force, as well as muscles that are of a certain architecture, and the architecture determines both how much force they can produce and how much damage they take on, and muscles that tend to be of different fiber types, they tend to have certain different levels or lengths, average length times of recovery. So, for example, for most people that train their biceps, their forearms, their calves, their medial and rear deltoids. Those are muscles that you can throw the kitchen sink in them and they still recover 2 days later, no matter what you did, right? Can you reliably train your quadriceps so hard that they're sore for 4 or 5 days at a time? Yes, you can go weeks on end increasing volumes and intensities, and your quadriceps will be sore for 4 or 5 days at a time. Next question is, what would you have to do for your rear delts to be sore week after week for 4 or 5 days at a time? I'm not even so sure ever in my life my rear medial delts got sore for 4 or 5 days at a time. Maybe the first time I ever trained them, probably not even then. Some muscles just plain old recover faster. Muscle size is the biggest key to that. So muscles like gluteus maximus, quadriceps, generally the hamstrings, pectoralis muscles, some muscles of the upper back, the lats, they might take a while to recover, maybe 2 to 4 days in some folks. Biceps, rear medial delts, maybe triceps in some people, though triceps are a pretty large muscle group. Medial delts, rear delts for sure, and calves. Man, with a very stimulative overloading training, you would probably see those muscles recover 1 to 2 days later, so they can probably tolerate higher frequencies. As a matter of fact, they should probably have high frequencies, because if you don't train those muscles often, well, if you don't use it, you lose it. They kind of start sloughing off. One of the most radical sort of discoveries I made in my training in the last several years, I started training my medial, rear delts, and biceps 4 times a week instead of twice like I used to, and I got unbelievable gains, even though my total volume per week didn't go up. My frequency went up, but I just split all my exercises apart further, and my muscles stopped shrinking in between training sessions.
Excellent.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I will also link to the article for people that want to read more about the subject in the
Awesome.
description.
Thanks so much.
Yeah. So next question is how you should adjust the frequency based on how experienced you are. Like if you're a beginner, a novice, and an advanced lifter, does it make a difference how you should adjust the frequency there?
Yeah, totally. So I think the first distinction we need to make is that there's novice/beginner and completely new lifter. A new lifter, I recommend all new lifters should work with coaches before they start lifting with themselves. I think 0 to 6 months is what I would call someone who's very much brand new. 0 to 6 months of training experience. I think they actually benefit from, relatively lower frequencies. Right, because they're going to get such shocks from minimal training. They need time to recover between sessions. Right, now you can play around with the volume intensity and stuff, but high frequency training for those folks, not only is it physiologically pretty much unnecessary because they get so much out of training they don't need to show up very often. In addition to that, it can be psychologically not disastrous but negative. Right, if you're like, hey, you ready to start training, and they're like, yeah, like, oh great, I'll see you 6 days a week. What the hell? Like maybe 3 or 4 is good to start. And then if they like it in the first 6 months, then after the first 6 months, their physiology is quite a bit used to that kind of training, and especially in a recovery perspective. At that point, people who are just beginning, they're not very close to their physiological potential. They're not particularly large usually in musculature, and they can't produce a whole lot of force. So that means the total amount of damage to homeostasis that they can incur in any one session is relatively low. And their recovery abilities are in ratio relatively high. And we can talk about this from even just a simple perspective of the ratio of your muscle cross-sectional area size to the power of your GI tract to flood nutrients into the blood. Like if you have the same abdominal size, the same stomach, the same intestine surface area, when you weigh 130 pounds, your biceps are tiny, your GI tract can feed your biceps just fine over the next several days, and they'll recover very fast. However, if your biceps are the size of what your intestinal tract used to be, right, you have the IFBB Pro arms or the size of your head, your GI tract's largely unchanged. I mean, your abdomen doesn't grow that much. Growth hormone grows your abdomen. It doesn't grow that much. Mm-hmm. So at that point, every single physiological process that's designed to recover you is much more limited. So for beginners, they can usually tolerate higher overloading frequencies, which means I don't even like the term training frequency. The question isn't how often you train, because you can come in and train light and do recovery training and benefit greatly. But how often can they really train hard, right? And the answer is probably the most often of everyone. Small, if female lifters especially tend to recover much faster. Their vascularization is generally better. Their forces they produce are lower. They can train every day, same muscle groups for 6 days a week, and usually get the best results like that, because anything less is just not enough. As lifters progress from that beginning stage into larger body weights, larger muscle cross-sectional areas, larger weights handled, the amount of fatigue from every session starts to go up really, really high. And then they have one of two things. They can either reduce their total training frequency, right? So they used to train 4 days a week. Now they train twice or something. Same body part, right? So same body part 4 days a week. Now they train it 3 times. Later they maybe train it twice. Or what's probably a better idea is to turn some sessions, keep some sessions at overload sessions. Okay, so we have 2 overload sessions we used to. Later in your career, it's going to look like this. So one session is going to be really overloading, the other is going to be more tailored towards recovery. And then very advanced athletes, they have a really overload session and a much easier session later in the week or several times in the week. So their overall frequency doesn't change, but the number of times per week that they provide real overloading stimulus should tend to decline. And that's something we've seen in powerlifting very, very well. Almost every good powerlifter almost unanimously will say that you can squat heavy just about once a week. Heavy. Now, you can squat week, but real overload, doing something you've never done before, if you do it more than once a week, there are ways to do it twice, but there's almost no good powerlifter who squats super heavy 3 times a week. You just can't handle that kind of fatigue. Now, how many people who weigh 160 kilos, how many 60-kilo lifters of 1 year experience can squat 2 times a week? Everyone? I mean, you'd have to be sick or something if you couldn't. I mean, there are people that squat the squat every day programs. They work great. That's a max squat, every day. Up until you reach a high level of muscularity and size and strength, you can get away with doing that stuff no problem. And it's actually probably a good idea. So, one of the worst things, and a little mini rant for you here, is when people listen to elite lifters and not even listen to what they're saying, but just look at what they're doing and try to copy it. Well, it works for them, but they're also gigantic and super strong. Chad Wesley Smith, who is, in my opinion, one of the great coaches and programmers in powerlifting, he takes, in his peaking phase, he takes overload squats once every 1.5 weeks, sometimes once every 2. My God, right? But his quads are the size of most people's waists. So people say, "Oh, Chad Wesley Smith trains like this," but the way he trains his junior lifters, people just starting out, he has them squatting hard 4 or 5 days a week. So it very much depends on progression and where you are in the sport and how big and strong you are. But yeah, I think that overload frequencies can be handled much better at higher frequencies by less developed lifters. And the more developed you get, the more you have to start playing around with volume intensity. You can't simply go hard all the time.
Yeah, excellent answer. And the next question, it's actually a follow-up question to what we talked about, because in recent years, there's been a lot of focus on increasing the frequency, and it's basically based on the Norwegian Frequency Project, if you've heard of it, with the Norwegian powerlifters. They actually equated the volume and trained either 3 days a week or 6 days a week, and they saw a much better improvement with training 6 days a week, both in terms of strength and hypertrophy. So a lot of, especially here in Norway, a lot of lifters, especially if they're interested in more hypertrophy, are training full body routines up to 5-6 days a week, where they divide the volume. What are your thoughts about doing the training that way as you get more advanced? I know you already talked a bit about it.
Yeah. For the purposes of strength, I think it's an interesting idea. It's also interesting for the purpose of hypertrophy, but we have to be very careful in hypertrophy, and here's why. Almost all of the most muscular people on the planet for probably the last 40 years have been training with relatively low frequency programs. That is reason for pause. Is bro science good? No. Should we just do whatever tradition says? No. We should investigate with science. But one scientific study that's well controlled does not immediately erase 40 years of experiential knowledge in the field. So very high frequency training for hypertrophy is a very interesting thing to consider. I would not immediately jump on the bandwagon and wipe the slate clean. The Norwegian study is a very good study. It is, however, one study. Generally speaking, in science, the amount of attention we give to one study is minimal. When there's 10 studies on a subject and they start to paint a better picture, then we start to think, oh man, maybe this is the way it is. Right? So I think that for the purposes of powerlifting training, splitting up sessions into more frequent sessions and doing more of an alternating volume intensity approach, I think that's a good idea for most lifters. I think if you have really, really big, strong super heavies, they might have to alternate their volumes and intensities a bit more, right? You can't just push those people 6 days a week. Is not going to be overloading every time. That's kind of insane. For hypertrophy purposes, for pure hypertrophy, I would split it up a little bit more by body part. I wouldn't just train the whole body every day, because for some muscles, everyday training is pretty good. For some muscles, everyday training might not be the greatest thing in the world. And then there is absolutely some evidence and absolutely some very good conjecture from a scientific perspective. Especially some of this has been made famous by Greg Knuckles. I'm not really sure if you know who he is.
Yeah, I've actually had an interview with him yesterday.
Yeah, well, very good. Yeah,
yeah.
so Greg has dug up some research and has said a lot of good things about the idea that for maximal hypertrophy, there may be times in your training when you need a lot of acute overload and a lot of muscle damage to really perhaps involve satellite cells to a larger degree, or whatever the mechanisms. You may not be able to just equate volume loads and just do a couple of squats every day and add that up to, I did 20 squats this week, because after no workout, during no particular workout, are you actually overloading, right? Overload results from a week, but in no particular workout is the overload incredible. So for example, does a mechanic have really strong and big forearms? He works on cars all the time, every day, more or less, minus weekends, and slowly over the course of time, he does work with bolts and wrenches. Yeah, a mechanic has big forearms, totally. Does he have the biggest forearms? No. Most powerlifters and bodybuilders have bigger ones, probably because every time they stimulate less frequently their forearms with really heavy weights, they get a much bigger effect, and then a healing, and then a repetition of effect. Whereas the little tiny effects that a mechanic experiences on his forearms after a while may not be enough to sum up really any meaningful adaptations, right? At some point, your body is so used to doing 2 sets of squats at a time that it doesn't matter how many 2 sets of squats you did that week. Your body's like, yeah, I'm doing it. Great. I can do it. I'm not going to grow much. So I think for some muscles, twice a week training is probably best. For some other muscles, maybe 3 times a week is best. And for some muscles, more or less everyday training would be a really, really good idea. I don't put much stock. I think the Norwegian experiment is a very good experiment as a standalone. I am absolutely not willing to change my training because of one experiment. I think anyone who's willing to do that is simply misunderstanding the scientific process. If more experiments come up and they start to show a similar idea, especially in high-level lifters, then I will be very curious as to the mechanisms involved. And certainly our theoretical understanding of hypertrophy definitely makes us think that, more frequent training is probably more likely to be better than less frequent. Like, for example, if they came out with a study that says once a week is the best way to hypertrophy, I'd be very, very skeptical of that. But everyday training for every muscle group for maximum hypertrophy, skeptical so far. Potentially very exciting research, but as of now, I'm not willing to hypothesize much as to mechanisms of something that's not very confirmed. Some other people I've read online have said that most of the data is on a couple of outliers, and if you take them out, then not much is different. Certainly depends on what outliers you take out, but there's always, every study has concerns with it, like is this just chance? Is it just by chance, or this and that? So maybe exciting, but we shall see. No crazy predictions quite yet.
Yeah, I actually have a video coming out in a couple of weeks with one of the researchers from the Frequency Project, where he actually talks more in detail about the study, because it hasn't been published yet. It's only an abstract in a book so far, but I know that it will probably be published later this year or early 2017. So,
You know, actually, it comes to mind that Lyle McDonald is the guy who has voiced some concern over the study.
yeah.
Did you talk to him about it? Did you ask him about it?
No, we were actually talking about a different subject. We had an
Gotcha.
interview on Monday where we talked about fat loss for females, but I've seen the discussion on the Facebook group and the questions he's asking about the outliers when you look at the graphs in the abstract. But
Yeah.
hopefully, when the video comes out with his name is Alexander Shirketai, we'll probably get the
Very cool.
discussion going. Yeah,
I'm curious.
yeah. So let's round it up with the last question. Is training frequency something you feel should be periodized during a training cycle?
Yes. Overload frequency should be periodized for sure, and thus, training frequency can also be. I think that during periods of active rest or periods of maintenance of muscle size, overload frequency should be reduced to allow for further recovery. It's been demonstrated very clearly that overload training as little as once a week, sometimes twice a week for very advanced lifters, is all that's needed to preserve muscle mass. Any more training and you get gains, but if your goal is to gain some muscle mass, then kind of maintain it for a while, drop some fatigue in preparation for a hard diet for a show, during that maintenance period, you absolutely should be dropping frequency because you just beat yourself up less that way. You do less work. And I'll tell you this is very, very important. There are many, many kinds of injuries. There's a certain class of injuries with which frequency is the biggest problem for re-aggravating them. And lowering frequency is the best way to get around them, right? Some injuries, like let's say you squat 405 for 10 usually. If you just squat 225, you don't feel a thing, injury's fine, right? So there, you can still squat with high frequencies, you just have to only squat heavy once or twice, and the others can be lighter, right? So totally fine. There are other injuries in which any squatting aggravates it, but as soon as you don't squat for a couple of days, it gets much better. Those kinds of injuries, you can't just play with volumes and intensities at the same frequency. You've got to remove training days, and that's a shitty injury to have, but there's a bunch of them. I'm sure you, in your own lifting career, have had examples like that. We're like, I just gotta leave my shoulder the hell alone. If I don't leave it alone, I'm just gonna be hurt forever. Even if I train light, it still hurts, right? And maybe some rehab instead of training is good. So, for example, when you're taking those maintenance phases before really cutting phases for shows, yeah, you should almost certainly lower the frequency. When you're going for hypertrophy, you should probably have optimal frequencies for hypertrophy. But when you are going for transitional phases, I think lowering frequency is a very good idea. You bet.
Okay, excellent, Mike. Thank you so much for taking the time to doing this interview. I know you have a great website and you also have some great in-depth articles on that website. Could you please tell us the name of the website?
Yeah, renaissanceperiodization.com. It's impossible to spell, so just Google it. But I guess you'll probably put up a link for that.
Yeah.
And it's good, it's a cool website. We offer a bunch of services, fat loss and training and diet and things of that nature. But we're getting into the article side more heavily. We will be soon, and some blog posts and things like that. So come check us out. Check us out on Facebook. I'm on Facebook. On Instagram, at RP Strength is actually a really big deal. We got like 1 trillion followers or something. And then come check me out on Facebook, Mike Israetel. As a public profile, so you can add me to a followers list and troll me or whatever. And I'll troll you back. It'll be fun.
Yeah. You also have some books about Renaissance periodization.
Yeah, so like we have a diet book called The Renaissance Diet, which really just sounds like a unique diet, but it's not. It's just a breakdown of scientific dieting into priorities and how calories are really important, macros are important, timing's not very important, but here are the details, food composition, supplements, etc. Then we have another book, Scientific Principles of Strength Training. So if folks that liked this podcast about training frequency, I mean, I've wrote something like 20 pages on training frequency and all the minute little details and rationale behind what I'm saying in that book. It's a 400-page 12-page book. It's a tome co-authored with Dr. James Hoffman and Chad Wesley Smith himself. So that book is one of my pride and joys because it's got a lot of really good stuff in there. And then we have a book called Renaissance Woman. It's a female dieting book. And focuses not just on physiology, but also the psychology of female dieting. Because as you know, females face some different landscapes and challenges. So, if you read all those books, you'll probably know more than me. And then you just come take my job, and I'll just be out in the street crying, homeless.
Thank you so much. Thanks again, Mike, and have a nice day. And we could probably do this again if you're interested on a different topic.
Sounds good. You just let me know.
Yeah, thank you so much.
All right,
okay,
take care.
Have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Take care.